washed because blood is flowing past this rapidly and kind of washing this portion of the cell. The concentration here is very low. So as this concentration increases, it produces kind of a siphoning effect. The fact that the concentration on this end is low, on that end is high, it really siphons the substances that accumulate here in the intercellular space by simple diffusion between different compartments of the astrocyte. Now I drew this astrocyte with only 2 dendrites, and the reason I did it is because there is a cell that looks just like it in the retina. It's called the Müller cell that has exactly this function. It's placed between capillaries and the external side of the retina, and it has exactly that role, and it's bipolar like this, and it hasn't studied very well, and this is exactly how potassium moves from this region to a region like the capillary where it gets washed, these high concentrations get washed out. Right. Astrocytes. Oligodendrocytes, as I said, produce myelin. I don't remember what each one of these cells is, but I'm just going to focus on F here, which is, I think this is an oligodendrocyte stained for myelin. It's like these also. They have this kind of starry shape. But in here, what this is an axon. I'll show you this light so you can see better. So here you can see the oligodendrocytes having that starry shape. But here you have axons of long tube-like thingies. And what you see is myelin forming these big, thick, covering these segments of the axon, but leaving certain spots devoid of myelin. Okay? That's a typical structure or histological aspect that peripheral nervous system will have. So the peripheral nervous system, basically your nerves and other structures, contain also a type of glial cell that has a different name, called the Schwann cell. And it produces myelin, similar to the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. Now, myelin is an interesting thing, and the way these cells produce it is also quite interesting. So let me just describe that. Myelin is a lipid, okay? And these cells, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, produce a lot of it. Most of their membrane is made of that particular lipid called myelin, and what they do is they take a cell. Let's say the Schwann cell is the simplest to explain. Takes an axon, and I'm going to show you the axon in cross section. So this is your axon. Some microtubules and some organelles you would see there. And what you will see is that there is a wrapping of membrane around and around and around up to about 200 fold, 200 turns. Lots of wrapping around it. Now, what is a very important property of lipids, of fats?
Polar and also.
They're hydrophobic, they're not polar, you said? Non-polar. Very hydrophobic, which means they don't let anything polar, like water or ions, go through. So what they basically do is insulate. It's like a plastic wrapping along the electric cables that feed all these elements in this room. Okay? It's basically an insulator that allows the cells not to short circuit with the next one, and other very important things that we're going to discuss later. Taking a picture of that, this one. No. But this is basically how do they do it? And that's during development, when you're still an embryo and growing into a fetus, and later on in life, especially during early childhood, your axons are going to be mostly bare, and what you're going to have is a cell, a Schwann cell sitting here with its nice nucleus, okay, there this may be, and that Schwann cell will start producing an extension, and you have to see it. I don't know if I can draw this in 3D, but something like this. And this extension is going to be a very broad, a broad extension. And that is going to work now, or start growing as a sheet that envelopes the whole patch of this axon. So this sheet is going to start wrapping around, okay? And then in cross section, it looks like, I'm starting to draw this like this. It starts wrapping it around. There are two membranes here with almost no cytoplasm, or axoplasm as it's called in the no cytoplasm. These are not. No cytoplasm here. Two membranes very tight against each other, wrapping around this axon, and then at the end of this first turn, they actually start squeezing in between the previous layers in the axon. So they wrap around inside, always in contact with the axon. The reason for that is because the axon itself is producing signals, trophic factors, that tell the Schwann cell what to do and when to stop. So there are these signals telling grow, 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 and so these guys are following those signals, okay? And they're wrapping therefore around it. One consequence of this is that this wrapping becomes tighter and tighter because there's always very little space here and ever less space. So they're wrapping tighter and tighter around it, making a very tight wrapping. And unfortunately, I don't know if the previous slide. I showed you before, I believe. Yeah. This is an axon cut in cross section like that in an adult already. And you can't really see very well the wrappings, but this thick layer is, I don't know, a couple dozen, maybe more, layers of myelin, of a Schwann cell, wrapping around each one of these axons. Now, Schwann cells can send more than one process, and they can do the same thing on other axons. Okay, so I don't know, an axon going across like this thing might be doing this around there, and around another one, and another one, a bunch of them. Same thing with oligodendrocytes. Each one of those branches, of those little arms, here, each one of these little arms, I have a very nice picture, wrap around a different cell. So oligodendrocytes can wrap around hundreds, I think, a huge number of cells. So each one of these feet goes and wraps a different cell. Okay? And the main function is to act as insulators, electrical insulators, as we will talk about in a little bit. Okay. That's all I want to say about glial cells. Any questions about this? You want to say? So, yes.
Did you put your slides up on the middle?
Yeah, I did.
I thought I had one before, but because I missed some of them. I missed some of them.
Okay, that's okay. My very skimpy notes are there too. The text, I'm following the textbook, so for the most part, most of this stuff. So I said that ions move across membranes, but I also said, and you said, that membranes are very, but you probably know from your foundations course or general bio course and high school and so on, that membranes are made of what primarily? Phospholipids. And phospholipids, as we've established, are insulating. They're they're non-polar, they're hydrophobic. So they don't let any water where any ions go through. In fact, if you put a pure lipid membrane between two salty compartments containing salt, you're not going to get much flow at all across it, not even water. Although water is not charged, it's polar, it doesn't make it through these phospholipids very easily. So they act, and the membrane acts as a very good insulator. So I'm talking about potassium ions moving out of the cell. How do they do that? Anybody know?
Have pumps.
Active transport channels, and what were that one? Potassium ion pump. Potassium ion pump. All right. So we have active channels, and we have pumps. Ion channels and pumps, which I'm going to use similar but related to transport mechanisms, but not identical. Okay, so these are all molecules, ion channels or proteins in some other pumps, in other transporters. Okay. So ions cannot move freely through a lipid membrane, phospholipid membrane. They need channels. And we call these little proteins channels because they act as such. They really act as little pores through the membrane. So they are made of proteins, and the walls form these structures that leave the core inside. So if you look at it from the top, you would really see little holes. I mean, you would have to look at the extremely high resolution, even the electron microscope doesn't let you see the hole, but there are other techniques where you can use X-rays, which have much higher resolution still. It's very difficult to do, but you can take a look at this in certain conditions, and you will see things that look like a pore. So you'll have a structure that looks like perhaps something like this. So something that surrounds something that looks like a hole in the middle. And doing a whole bunch of experiments over the last century, or the second half of the last century, people have established that these pores act as channels. We call them channels because they really act as a hole, as a pore, filled with water. So an ion can move through it from one end to the other, okay, as if it was diffusing in water. Except that diffusion happens in that very restricted, hollow, semi-hollow thing, pore. So that's why we call them ion channels. They're proteins. Proteins filled with water. And when I say filled, I should say in quotations, because it's only a few water molecules in each. They have their, they act as spores. And they have other properties that we're going to start talking about later on that are very important. But those are the very basic properties. And if the channel is open, and one of the properties is that they can close, so this can be regulated, then they will let an ion go through as if it was diffusing. So the same rate as an ion diffusing across this very short distance. If you had 10, 20, or 30 nanometers. Okay, so very short distance. So it's rapid. I mean, it's not very fast, but it's a very short time it takes to do that. And that will affect the voltage inside the cell, because I've heard of so-called Ohm's law, and this is one of the very few equations I'm going to write. Ohm's law says that a voltage change, which I'm going to represent as delta V,
Excuse me.
is
Thank
exactly
you.
proportional to the amount of current flowing between 2 points. Let's imagine these 2 points here, between inside and outside and inside. Okay, so current flowing between 2 points in space across a resistor, an electrical resistor. Okay, so this guy, because it's very narrow, so it's filled with things like water and crevices and so on, exerts some resistance to the flow of ions through it. Okay? Just like there is resistance for ions to flow within water. Water acts as a friction, produces a little friction, molecular friction on the ions and so on. So there is resistance. Remember this one. Okay? It's very important. It determines. It's basically the fundamental equation in neuroscience. And just about everything can be explained by this equation. It has several different forms, but this is the most basic one. And it describes how an electrical current produces a change of voltage. It applies to wires as well, and so on. Okay. So, what about pumps or transporters? Transporters are also proteins. Pumps and transporters are also proteins, but they work in a different way. They don't produce a force. They actually take an ion, they don't have to be an ion, they can transport our things. They can take a molecule or an ion from one side and move it to the other side. I'm not going to go into the molecular aspects of it, but you can imagine kind of an arm grabbing something on one side and leaving shoving it to the other side. Okay? So pumps, also called active transporters, derive energy from ATP. Use ATP, and that's the source of energy by which they do this. They can either from one side make it cross across this very unfriendly environment, hydrophobic environment, and then move it onto the other side. The very famous one that you probably all have heard about is the sodium-potassium pump, or ATPase. So molecules that do ATP are all ATPases. This one is called the sodium-potassium pump, or ATPase, and it's found in every single cell in our bodies. Very high concentrations, and what it does is moves sodium. I'm going to do it like this, all right? Without it poured inside, moves sodium out. In fact, moves 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions that it moves in. A very important molecule because it produces this asymmetric movement, and on the one hand, it moves sodium out of the cell and moves potassium into the cell, therefore explaining in part why we have more potassium inside the cell, as I said before, than outside. Okay. But it also, notice that it also moves, if each one of these guys have a single charge, it also moves charges asymmetrically. It moves more positive charges out, and so basically it leaves one negative charge inside the cell for every ATP molecule that it burns. That's also somewhat important, and we'll see why. So this guy, for that reason, it's called electrogenic. Creates this electric gradient, or participates, participates in the generation of an electric gradient, as well as 2 chemical gradients: sodium, more outside than inside; potassium, more inside than outside. And transporters, just down here, other transporters, not active, so just transporters or passive transporters. What these guys do is, instead of using ATP as a source of energy, they use another source of energy. Does anybody know how? GTP? No. That would be an active transporter too, because GTP is basically, for all purposes, the same as ATP. It's just binds to different molecules, but it has the same effect. It's hydrolyzed to GTP and so on.
Protein phosphates?
Say that again?
Protein phosphates?
No. So, fine. Passive transport moves.
Okay, these are passive.
Passive. They're just transporters that are not active, so we call it passive.
Calcium. Calcium.
Calcium. What about calcium?
I think it moves in later than the initial rush of the sodium potassium pump.
No, although calcium, there are calcium transporters that use calcium. But what I want to get from you is what is the essence of how this transport occurs? Not what exactly is transported, but how.
Wasn't it like a calcium molecule that goes in or out of the cell?
Yes, that's exactly it. So it uses another gradient that already exists that will tend to tend to move in one direction. So if you have, let's say, a gradient for sodium, which is the most common one, okay, and that is established in great part by this active transporter. Now you have a gradient of sodium because more sodium moved out of the cell than inside. So now you have a lot of it. Outside, it will tend to move inside, and that acts as a source of energy. But it's already established by another mechanism. So in that sense, it's passive. The gradient is there already. From the point of view of this molecule, that sodium is already concentrated outside. If that is now linked to something else that is not very concentrated outside, in fact, might be more concentrated inside, for example, glucose. Glucose is needed inside cells. How does it get into cells? This is one mechanism. It is coupled to the transport of another substance, and very typically it's sodium because of the ubiquity of this ATPase, of this pump, that creates the gradient, sodium gradient in just about every cell. So glucose is other sugars as well, amino acids and so on, are very commonly linked to sodium. So calcium is another ion that you can couple things to because they're calcium ATPases. There are active transports for calcium. And calcium and sodium are the most common ones. I forget if there is another one, but those are the main ATPases. And so you can create very large gradients for calcium as well, and calcium will be more concentrated outside, and that can then be coupled with the transport of other ions. For example, potassium, which is very concentrated inside. So how do you get something? You get its concentration gradient. Well, either you use ATP as a source of energy, or you use another gradient. So those are the three ways by which they move across membranes. We're going to concentrate mostly on channels from now on. Okay? And let me just tell you a few facts. What time is it? And then we're going to stop. 5 more minutes, and then I'll give you the little quiz. And let me just say that when you take a neuron, here, basically it's divided now. This is completely closed. Right? There's a border around the neuron. And if you were to put a probe inside the neuron here, which you can do, you do that all the time in my lab, you can make a very, very fine tube. And you can heat it and stretch it to a very fine point, put it on some manipulator that won't shake too much, and you can drive it into a cell. You can really pierce the membrane, drive it into a cell, and then connect this to some device that we call an electrical amplifier, or other names, and record what voltage you measure inside of the cell. But remember that voltage is always measured as a difference, and that's why this is called delta V. It's measured as a voltage in one side, or one point, versus the voltage at another point in space. Okay, there is no such thing as an absolute voltage. That you did physics and studied electricity, you will have seen that the definition of voltage is how much energy it takes to move a charge from one point to another. That's the definition of voltage from physics. In physics, we're going to define it as simply the voltage difference between the poles. So you need a reference. And that reference is usually the outside of a cell, right around the cell. What's this transporter here? And we call that, we symbolize that as these little lines. So that's your reference or ground. And the reason why it's called ground is because the reference is usually attached to a wire that's stuck in the ground. Like that's the pipes of the building or something, or a rod really literally stuck in the soil, in the ground, because the earth acts as a humongous capacitor that absorbs current, and so you can use that as a reference for anything in the electrical medium. So if you measure the voltage inside a cell versus the medium outside of it, what you will see is what we call the resting potential. Resting membrane. In most neurons, it's typically around, it would be from anywhere between minus 30 or 40 millivolts to minus 100 millivolts, thousands of volts. So something like 1,000th of the voltages that are driving your cell phones or the lights here and so on. Okay. Tiny, but measurable, very easily. These amplifiers are very sensitive, and in the past it was a little more complicated, but when transistors were invented by then, or even radios with incandescent tubes and so on, that was already possible. So you can use those as amplifiers of voltage. Okay, so you measure a tiny thing, amplify it, and you can look at it in the monitor. Tiny voltages, but those voltages change. We call the resting voltage the voltage that you would measure when you just impale the cell. You put an electrode, we call that an electrode, impale the cell, and you measure voltage. And I'm going to call the membrane